Hello, everyone. It is my privilege to welcome each one of you to this important event, AIIAS Seminary Colloquium Series. We are going to have this Seminary Colloquium series every third Thursday of the month, and I am going to let Dr. Mueller explain about this series later. Once again, welcome each one of you to this important event, and I hope and pray that you will be blessed as we listen to this experienced pastor, professor. Dr. Mueller is working at the AIIAS Seminary as associate professor, and also he is the assistant dean. He has penned a lot of articles, and I believe that we are going to be blessed by his presentation. Before we move forward, I would like to have the word of prayer. Shall we pray? Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you this evening for giving us this opportunity to share your word. I pray for Dr. Mueller that you will use him mightily and that he will be able to present the presentation that he prepared for the audience. I hope and pray that, Lord, you will continue to bless AIIAS as well as the workers and all the people. And I also pray that you will bless the audience tonight, that they will be able to understand the presentation. I pray for this technology and also for the internet, that we will not have any interruption during the presentation. I pray that you will be with the speaker. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Friends, we are going to have Q&A after the presentation. If you have a question regarding the presentation, I encourage each one of you to make sure that you place your question or comment in the comment section, whether YouTube or Facebook. I encourage you to type your question so that the presenter, Dr. Mueller, will answer after his presentation. I now invite Dr. Mueller to take his time and present ritual purity.
Good evening and welcome to you, all of you out there in the great ether of the internet. I want to welcome you, first of all, to this Colloquium series and tell you just a little bit about it. So this is still part of what Kima has just announced, and I want to thank him for the gracious introduction. We have started this year as a seminary, still under the auspices of this pandemic, and we realized that we want to connect to more people within our community and outside. And so we created two webinar series. The first one was the professional series, and we will have that every first Sunday of the month. And that is for all the pastors out there that need input for their ministry, that want to get injections of knowledge from our seminary professors, and also enter into a dialogue. If you want to share some of the issues that you want to learn more about, that is the place to do that. This Colloquium series is meant to fulfill the needs within our campus because we have Colloquium credit that some students need for their degrees and for their programs. And we have been struggling. How can we do that during a pandemic? And so this is one response to that. Also, this is meant to go quite a bit beyond what we can teach in the classes. So this is a advanced track or a deeper study. And so this is not meant to be as practical as our professional series. It's supposed to be more abstract in nature. And you will notice that in this series and as we in this evening, as we go along, it will not be as practical, but more theoretical, to supplement and to extend and to enter into a dialogue with you as an audience about some of the things that you've been learning in your classes, and how to go one step beyond and how to address some issues that go beyond what we have in the normal, what we can do in a normal class period. All of our classes, our teachers would love to teach you more, but we have limited time and classes need to conclude at the end of the semester. The colloquium is there to give you a really in-depth view of a specific issue and to really dig deep. So that's the purpose of this series. And we wanted to keep it nonetheless interesting enough for you and engaging enough. Just listening to papers and papers being read and presented is very important, but there are other aspects to learning and growing that are important as well. So we've divided this series. It will happen every third Thursday of the month. We have 3 things that we'll do alternatively. One of them will be internal lectures and presentations. So that is from one of the faculty or maybe a doctoral student that has done some significant research. We're going to present and showcase some of those very profound and deep insights into our academic world. So these are more academic in nature. And that will be an internal part. We'll have an internal professor or doctoral student that will present a paper or an idea. Then the second thing that we want to do is in the next month, we want to present and have guest speakers that we often don't have for our class lectures. And so we want to give you input from people outside of our direct community, our AIIAS community here. And I can already introduce to you the speaker and the presenter for next month. We will have John Peckham from Andrews University, who has published several books and is currently publishing and just published a new book. And so we'll have a dialogue and about what he's contributing and what he's doing and what his cutting edge research is showing him about God, because he's working a lot on the concept of God and who God is. So that will be next month. So be sure to join us next Thursday. We'll have this guest presentation. And then, and this is already important to note at this point, the third cycle, the third element of our series, so it'll go alternating between these 3. The third one is a book review. It is so important for us as scholars to keep on reading, to enjoy books and engage with each other on books, because that's how we learn. And so I already want to introduce the first book that we're going to be doing for our book session, which will be in 2 months. And that book that we're going to be studying is Augustine's City of God. Now, that is a really old book. We will have a mixture of really old books that have just carried their way throughout history, but we'll also have some cutting edge books, some that have been recently published, and we're trying to do it from a variety of fields. We have chosen Augustine's City of God because it is one of the most influential books in history. I personally haven't read it, so I will have to take this opportunity in the next 2 months to read it myself. I have read about it, but I do want to read it myself as well. So I look forward to this, to dig into the church fathers and their contribution to the discussion. Luther was largely influenced by Augustine because he was an Augustinian monk. And the City of God played a huge role in Luther's theology. Now, we come out of the Reformation, and we cite the Reformation as one of the places that we find part of our origins. So this is going to be an exploration and looking back at what influenced the Reformation and what influenced Augustine and what was he thinking. And then we'll have a discussion about what we agree and disagree, what we liked and what we didn't like about the book. So you can already go to the library. We'll put the book on reserve, and you can start exploring and start reading this so that you're prepared for our discussion that we'll have in 2 months' time. So these are the 3 elements that we'll be doing, and we'll always switch between those 3: a internal professor, a guest professor, and then a book report, a book review. That we will announce. So I just want to let you know what is coming for this series, and I look forward to dialoguing and being engaged with you right here in this online form, but yet connected in spirit and in thoughts. With that introduction about what this is and that it is a little different If you expected this to be the same as the professional series, it is not the same. So I invite you at this point to put on your thinking cap and to put on a suit of graciousness as we interact with all kinds of different ideas about purity. So I'm going to transition now from introducing the colloquium to now talking about the topic of purity. The topic of purity in our circles might be an underrated and yet really important topic that we very often don't address. Because we all have certain views and expectations, and these surface in a variety of places. And I'm often surprised to find the influence of purity thought as we engage with life and life all around us. Let me share just 2 places where purity thinking and thought becomes very important, or maybe 3 elements. One place where purity thinking, even though we might not express it in that terminology, in our Adventist setting become quite important, are what death rituals does a culture have? Those are related very often to principles. And why do we do the things that we do at funerals? What view do we have of burial or cremation and some of these issues? Very often, there are large philosophical thoughts behind that. Another place where purity becomes a critical factor is how we relate to communion. What is permissible? Can we not? How should we perform communion? Who is allowed to pass out the communion? A lot of purity thoughts come into that. For example, you will very often find in many cultures around the world, and one of my churches had this very distinct practice, that there were the women, the role that the women played was the preparation and the lifting up of a, so to speak, veil or tablecloth under which all the emblems were prepared, but they were not allowed, even though they were deacons and even ordained deacons, they were not allowed to pass out the emblems. Why not? Is it because of an ordination issue? Is it because of a male-female thing? Or is it because of an underlying purity thing? Many times, cultures have informed me that women cannot do this because of purity issues, menstruation, for example, because women might be menstruating. Therefore, they are not allowed to pass out the emblems because they could be impure. That is a reason that I've heard specified, not just for the communion table, but also for other places. And so that is a place where we actually, without really talking about it, yet we are practicing something that is related to purity issues in Scripture. So as you can see, there are some places where purity actually affects us largely, and I would actually argue that there is one other place, and that is mission. But for that, we'll dive a little bit into our topic. I've been asked many times to present on this, and so far there was no opportunity, but after quite a number of our students asked, can we have a full and more in-depth examination of this topic? I want to share that and do kind of an in-depth study with you. And the place that I'm going to pick as an opening is the largest purity passage in the Gospels. And that is in Mark chapter 7, verses 1 to 23. That is an interesting chapter. You probably know it well. And when you think about purity and impure and all of that, you might actually be thinking about this passage right from the get-go. This is the passage where the disciples are going through a grain field, and some of the religious leaders have already gathered to observe everything that they're doing, and now they're plucking the grains and eating them. And the religious leaders accuse the disciples of, you're not following the tradition of the elders, which commands you to wash your hands with a fist. as Mark explains. And then Mark goes into a very long, in fact, the longest in the whole gospel, explanation of all the ritual practices that Jews at the time practiced. Baptizing, literally, that's the submerging and baptizing even their beds. And all the Jews practiced this in the empire. Jesus responds to the accusation that the disciples are not following the purity rules by citing first a passage from Isaiah and then citing a passage from the Mosaic law, saying that this is, look at the example and the hypocrisy that you have. You're subverting the law of Moses for the law of God with the korban. Then there's a sudden shift. See, Jesus turns to the crowd, and we never hear about the religious leaders again. And the disciples that have been inactive now become very active. And Jesus tells a parable, and this is a very cryptic parable that scholars have been debating for decades and about how to interpret this passage. And the parable concludes with a statement. Well, in our translations, it says, Jesus declared all foods clean. Literally, it only says, it's a participial phrase, it only says declaring all foods clean. And the question what that means, it's a very contentious statement. What that means is, that's what we're going to be looking at. What does it mean to cleanse, cleansing all foods or declaring all foods clean? Then Jesus finishes this whole passage by saying what is more important than these ritual practices is an ethical code. And then he lists a whole bunch of ethical statements. Okay, so that is a quick overview of the passage. Now you can read it yourself, and probably you know it quite well. This is found in Mark chapter 7, 1 to 23. I wanted to just give you a quick overview, PowerPoint overview, before we turn to a paper that I'll be reading to answer some of the questions that I want to raise in this PowerPoint. So I will share my screen here and invite you to join me in looking at this PowerPoint. So here we go. Let me see if we can do that in presentation mode. Here we go, purity in Mark. And I just wanted to highlight the different approaches that have been brought to understand this passage, because it is a very complex passage. Now, in the Christian world in general, over the various decades, there has what we could call been a traditional approach. And that talks and uses several arguments to try to understand the passage. Everybody tries to put out arguments and look at a passage from a certain perspective. And I'm just going to highlight in brief terms what the different approaches are. So the traditional approach says Mark is writing from Rome, most likely, to a very Roman audience. We know that he's not writing to a Jewish community because he's explaining all kinds of Jewish practices right there in this passage, in fact, even. And he's explaining a lot of things such as Aramaic, which would have been spoken in Palestine, that the people understood there, but the Romans, of course, wouldn't have been. So Mark says, well, Jesus said, Tabita kum, or Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, and each time Mark says, well, let me translate that for you. So the narrative asides tell us who Mark is writing to and who he thinks his audience is. So there's a lot of indicators that he's writing to and in a Greco-Roman context. And so that explains already, well, if he's writing in that context, what does that say about food? What understanding would they have had for food? The traditional approach also identifies that there are two different sections and events that are not historically one event. They're just put together by Mark. And this is actually a common thing. For example, we see that a lot in Matthew chapter 13. We have all kinds of kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven parables. And Matthew has just collected them into one place and into one speech, though they would have been spoken at different times. So gospel writers at times put things close together to talk about a theme not because of a temporal proximity, but because of a topical proximity. Both of the ideas here would be that because it's a different audience, because it's a completely different style in writing, and because it addresses different issues, these two passages, 7:1-13 and 14-23, are talking about two separate events. Mark just has put them back to back, as many places in the Gospels put related stories close together. And so if that's the case, the traditional approach argues that verse 19 then should be considered a generic command, not something specific to the first section of Mark chapter 7:1-13. It should be instead understood as a generic, Jesus in general declared, because the parable is a generic parable that starts in verse 14. And the summary would be, Jesus abrogates the Mosaic law and instead institutes an ethical law that we find at the end of the passage, because that's where we actually have the difficult phrase, declaring all foods clean. That's the traditional approach. And it takes a very close look at the passage and the issues within the text. There's a different approach, and that is an approach from Jewish studies that comes to an opposite conclusion. And that is, the kosher laws are one of the two distinctive markers of Jews within the Roman Empire in the 1st century AD. The two markers would have been the Sabbath and kosher food. Those are the two things that Jews were known for in the whole Roman Empire. They might have not been very good at any of the other laws of honoring their parents or of not stealing or any of those things. That did not make the cut, so to speak. But those two things really stuck out. And you might have in your community, I remember when I was working in temporary jobs as a teenager, the one thing that stood out, I'm not drinking beer and I'm not smoking, right? There are two things that they're very visible, the Sabbath observance and the kosher food. In this passage, Jesus is obviously talking to a Jewish community. If Jews would have understood that Jesus is saying, you don't have to, you can eat whatever, you can eat pork, that he would have been accused of blasphemy, because this is not possible. This is so entrenched that anywhere in the empire you went, Jews might have been good Jews or bad Jews, but they all observed kosher food. So this is unfathomable to think that Jesus would not have been killed on the spot if he would have really, if people would have understood him to abrogate the food laws of Leviticus. Also, this is a very cryptic phrase. It's a participial phrase, and it just says cleansing all foods. It doesn't even specify who the author, who the person is. Most translations say it should be translated as Jesus cleansed all food, but the addition of Jesus is just a logical inference. The text actually just says cleansing all foods. Some have argued that the closest antecedent to this should be the pit, the place that you do your business. So the toilet or the commode should be the antecedent, and the toilet cleanses everything, because the text is actually unclear. That would make no logical sense, by the way. So we have some interpretive issues, but everybody agrees that it's impossible for somebody with this, in this Jewish studies category, with this cryptic passage, to just flat out remove something as essential as kosher food to the Jews. And Acts chapter 10 and 11 demonstrates that Peter obviously did not understood that Jesus had done that. Otherwise, he would have just followed suit. The conclusion being, from Jewish studies, Jesus did not abrogate food laws. Now, the strength of this argument, that it is a historical, this is a social science setting, this tells us a lot about and informs us of the social environment that Jesus lived in, but it doesn't really deal in detail with the text. Linguistics has also contributed to this, and you will find large sections in every dictionary, and they deal with this problem from a different perspective. What is the meaning of koinos and koino, to defile? And that is so prevalent in this passage. In fact, it appears 7 times in this passage. What does it mean? What does it relate to? How does it relate to the semantic field of ritual purity? And just to add to that complexity to it, koinos and koino actually just means common. It is something that is common. Only in the sense of food would we translate it as defiled. Very often we could just say common. So for example, we talk about Koine Greek, which is from the same root of the word, and it means the common language, the language that everybody spoke. So how does it suddenly appear that this word common appears in a ritual purity context? That is odd. That doesn't make so much. How did it get there? Additionally, the Septuagint never uses that word in the biblical canon of the Old Testament in that sense. Koinos is used, but always in the sense of they had things in common. That doesn't mean defiled. The special connection between koinos connected to food suddenly gives a new meaning. But what is that meaning? And how does it relate to the more common words of vebelos or bebelos and akathartos, which clearly mean to be unclean or to have some sense of uncleanness? There's even a third one, mino, which is another word that reflects ritual impurity. So how does koino relate to that? Linguistics have struggled with it, and there are different approaches in each dictionary, but usually their conclusion is they overlap almost entirely between koino overlap entirely with akathartos or bebelos. And there are different views on that, but in essence, they say it basically means the same. There's no distinction between these words. That is how you will find it in every dictionary. This passage, though, is unique that it doesn't just touch purity issues, but also law issues. Which part of the law do the kosher laws refer to in responding to these purity laws? What part of the law? Is it how do we categorize the law? And this becomes complicated when we talk about Leviticus 11. How does the New Testament in general view the Mosaic law? Should we understand, how should we understand Paul in this matter? How should we understand the Gospels? Are the Gospels influenced by Paul, or is Paul influenced by the Gospels? Now, certainly Paul wrote before the Gospels were written, but how should we relate those two? What part of the Mosaic law is the New Testament talking about? Are they talking about different laws at different times, or is there just one view of the law? Is the law just the 10 Commandments, or is it the whole Mosaic law? Is it certain sections of the Mosaic law? When some authors argue that the law is no more, is that only some parts or all parts? And then certainly the question that is in this larger picture is, what is the New Testament relation between salvation through grace and the keeping of the law? Are those different things or same things? And then which law? So the law category comes into play and becomes a large issue. And I think very often from an Adventist approach, we have argued very much on a law basis, but that produces some of its own problems. Let me explore just for a moment how Adventists have generally approached this passage. Very often you will hear that it just said, well, the law of the Old Testament is explicit and needs to be upheld. So when in Bible studies or even in presentations, well, see, Leviticus 11 is very clear and it's the law of God, and therefore we should keep it. But the problem with this approach is, which law of the Old Testament needs to be upheld? Because we certainly don't do all of the laws. For example, if we talk about purity laws, I have not seen anybody stand at the door of a church and say, an elder of the church says, Mrs. So-and-so, have you been menstruating? You're not allowed to come into the church. Or approached a man, because purity laws go both ways, not just for women. Have you had an emission, a nightly emission? Have you touched a dead person recently or a dead animal? Have you done the proper washings? Have you come to the temple and washed yourself? Have you waited till the evening and then prepared yourself in a very specific way for that washing? The Old Testament is very clear. In fact, Leviticus 11 itself is the place where you have the clear description of how to wash yourself. do we practice those ritual washings, not hygienic washings? This is not about soap and water that we hear a lot about in this pandemic. Wash for 20 seconds or for 2 happy birthdays or whatever method you've heard. That is hygiene. We're not talking about hygiene. We're talking about ritual purity. The Jews had mikvaots. Those are baths, and we find them archaeologically in many places around the Jewish community. Do we have mikvaots? No. So then are we actually doing the ritual purity laws? In fact, if we take a closer look, we don't follow Leviticus 1 through 10, which talks about how the priest should dress and how the sacrifices should be administered, and Leviticus 12 to 15, which talks about these purity laws that I've just been describing. Do you have a spot on your arm or anywhere on your body, a white spot? Then you cannot be a member of the community. You have to be brought to the priest to be evaluated, and then you need to be put outside. That is also impurity if you have skin disease. If you've had a childbirth, you're not allowed to be participating in the worship experience because you're unclean. Do we do that? Do we uphold these? No, we actually don't in our practices. So Leviticus 12 to 15, we don't practice. Leviticus 16, we say, is a symbolic action that is now referred to in the heaven. 17 through 19, we basically do not uphold. It talks about not cutting the temples of your hair, which is the sideburns here, and it talks about not having clothes made of 2 different types of fabric and all these kinds of things. We don't adhere to those anymore. So which law should be upheld? And can we just point to Leviticus 11 and say that needs to be upheld, but chapter 12 should not be upheld? For what reason? What is our argument for that basis? Well, we've often divided them and said we'll divide the law into various categories, into a moral law and into a civil law and into a health law and into a sacrificial law. And those are wonderful concepts, but they're not biblical. They're not encoded as such in the biblical text. There's no distinction. Lying is both a civil infraction as well as a moral infraction. And here in Leviticus 11, there is no argument that please don't eat pork because it's not healthy for you. That health reasons are not the issue for the code, for the Levitical code of clean and unclean meats or the kosher laws. That is not the reason that the text gives us. So these are constructs that we have put upon the text to divide it, to make sense of it. They're understandable. They're to some extent logical, but they overlap in many, many places. Which laws should be upheld? Well, we might say Leviticus 17 through 19 are more civil. They talk about civil law. They talk about how to administer a field and how to administer weights at a market and all of those. Those are civil laws. But at the same time, when Jesus cites which is the highest commandment of all, he doesn't cite the 10 commandments. He cites the holiness code, Leviticus 17 through 19, and says that is the highest law. So that is interesting. This whole discussion of law is one that we have promoted, but there's a lot of questions that we need to address, especially when we talk about this issue. Another argument has been put forth, and you've heard that for probably many years, that the distinction of clean and unclean animals predates the Sinaitic covenant, and we would refer to the story of Noah, where there is a distinction, 7 of 1. Is it 7 pairs or 7 individuals? The text isn't quite clear, and only a pair of the unclean animals, those that aren't being sacrificed. And so we have a predating of this division. It doesn't actually specify that this should be for food consumption as well, this distinction, but it could be implied and inferred. The question, though, is for a universal law, and this is the argument. The argument is that universal laws that are not bound to the Mosaic law and are only repeated in the Mosaic law extend and are demonstrated before the event and after the event. So we would argue, for example, that the Sabbath is a universal law because it exists in creation long before it is written on stone tablets and long before we have rules about what to do on Sabbath and what not to do on Sabbath in the Levitical code, which is a reflection of the Sinaitic covenant. And it also postdates that we're supposed to keep the Sabbath afterwards, and we will even keep the Sabbath in heaven. So we have both the predating and the postdating. Therefore, it is a universal law, and the Sinaitic law only repeats what is already established. But in the case of clean and unclean foods, while we could say there is some hints of a predating, it becomes a little more problematic when we come to the New Testament, because there's no explicit command that thou shalt only eat clean and unclean meats. The only thing that we could say is that the text does not say that we shouldn't do it anymore. So there is a certain absence of condoning that you can eat anything from an Adventist perspective. Many others would say, well, but Colossians 2 verse 16 says you shouldn't worry about anything, any food. Don't let people tell you what is right or not about food. Romans 14 talks about anything as edible, and don't just the weak people eat vegetables, but if you're strong, you can eat whatever. 1 Corinthians 8 verse 8 has a passage about how you can eat and shouldn't worry about it. 1 Timothy 4, Hebrews 13. There's many implicit references that it is okay to eat anything. Some might say these are actually explicit references, but they don't address the issue per se, and very often they are clouded in a slightly different context. So I'm just saying they're implicit, but certainly we don't have a command to continue the rules of Leviticus 11. There is no statement of that per se. And so this universal law idea, which builds itself on the theory of it needs to predate and postdate, kind of is on shaky ground, because the postdating that it exists afterwards is not firmly established. It predates, but we don't have an indication of postdating. So those are the challenges to our passage here. Now, there are also some issues with the passage itself. So a couple of the things in the Markan passage we have to think about and answer. How many pericopes or historical events are there? Are there two separate, or is this one? And how would we know? What do the narrative asides say about the passage? Also, is Mark exaggerating? Because he does say some interesting things. He says, all the Jews wash even their beds, and they wash with a fist. And those seem to be very exaggerated claims that every Jew in the empire is doing it. We know that that was not the case, and that they're washing and baptizing beds. And this whole thing about washing with a fist, we have no real outside evidence for that. So is Mark just exaggerating this whole story? How does the genre of that this is a conflict story affect the interpretation? This is a conflict story where there's a fight between Jesus and the religious leaders. It's not a miracle, it's not a healing story, it's a conflict story. Does that make a difference? How should the parable be interpreted? This parable is very difficult and tricky in the center of the passage. And in fact, it's so tricky that the disciples say, well, Jesus, we don't get it. How should we understand it? And even Jesus' answer is not as clear. Not clear enough because it seems that Mark is adding this phrase, cleansing all foods. That's his interpretive statement. It's another narrative aside. So even Mark does not think that was clear enough. And so he adds this statement that his readers can understand. And that actually makes it harder for us to understand. So there's an interesting conundrum there. So that brings us to this phrase. What does the phrase cleansing all food mean? Why the cryptic reference? And even the question of who is saying that, or what is cleansing? What agent is cleansing it? Is it the pit, the commode, or is it Jesus, or is it something else? Is it the process itself? The passage isn't clear. And then why does the passage end in an ethical teaching if it began with an argument about tradition and then went to a parable and suddenly you're with an ethical teaching? Those are all questions that we need to wrestle with as we enter this important topic of how do we relate to purity issues today. And I'm just raising these questions in your mind. I believe there are answers to all of them. And some of them I will answer in the paper that I want to present to you at this point. So this was kind of an extended introduction to share with you the main issues of this passage and what we need to look at. So with that, I'm going to try to exit here and share with you a paper, and we'll see how far we get as we go. So we're going to talk about uncleanness and defilement in the Gospel of Mark. And I believe I need to share my screen again. So here's the paper, and you're invited to read along. Mark's longest conflict story in chapter 7, 1 to 23 addresses purity concerns and has typically been understood as an abrogation of Jewish food laws. This prevailing view considers the cleansing activity of verse 19, the katharitzo, cleansing all foods, in the context of unclean animals of Leviticus 11. However, this article will re-examine the purity terminology in Mark 7 and argue that the cleansing refers to the 7 references to defilement, koinos and koino, in the pericope itself. Based on the Markan context, the eating with unwashed hands, and the intertext in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, 43 to 15, and Acts 10 and 11, a nuanced understanding of purity terminology emerges. Defilement, koinos and koino, refers to Second Temple concerns regarding touch impurity, and unclean foods refers to animals in a permanent state of impurity. The conflict story thus challenges the prevailing understanding of touch contamination rather than addressing kosher food. The placement of this incident at the transition point from Jesus' Jewish to his Gentile mission indicates that Mark's Jesus views Gentiles as being no more or less existentially unclean than Jews. So here a short overview of the history of interpretation. I'll jump over this part because I've already pointed out the main ideas without now going into the various specific ideas here. So we'll jump over this part. Now we get to the purity and Jewish studies that I also highlighted. So this is talking about some of the points that I summarized already earlier. Now we turn to purity in Mark, and I think this deserves a little more discussion. It is not surprising that scholars with varying suppositions about the terms used in the text and who utilize diverse methodologies come to different conclusions. Obviously, we come to different conclusions. Nobody looks at a passage the same way. The traditional view is strong in the discussion of the Markan text, while the newer disciplines explore the historical, linguistic, and intertextual context. In order to solve the difficulties in Mark 7, both contributions need to be brought together. The purity passage in Mark is unique on several fronts. It is the longest conflict story in the Gospels, as well as the longest passage dealing with purity. It is the only passage in the Gospel referring to koinos and koino. It is located at the turning point of the bread motif, or alternately at the center of the passages around the Sea of Galilee. At the outset, the genre of the passage is critical to a proper understanding. At the heart of the passage is a conflict story that expands into a teaching event. The first section is a conflict initiated by the religious leaders on the topic of unwashed hands, but quickly dominated by Jesus' response. The teaching event, rather than being a legal treatise, revolves around the enigmatic parable first addressed to the crowds. Only in the private dialogue with the disciples does Jesus expound on the parable, verses 17 to 23. As such, the setting of a legal text, such as Matthew 5 to 7, is quite different from Mark chapter 7, 1 to 23. So let's, 1 to 23. Let's look at the first section, Mark 7, 1 to 13. Determining the genre of the passage as a conflict story over purity concerns does not imply that this passage has nothing to contribute about the law. Undeniably, the passage in Mark contains legal terminology, though the prevailing issues remain purity concerns. Surprisingly, the passage is rooted in a positive view of the Mosaic law, not a negative one. From the outset, Mark points the conflict to the tradition of the elders in his explanatory side note in verse 3. According to Mark, the Jewish ritual purification practices are governed by the tradition of the elders. After setting the stage, it is no surprise that this tradition of the elders then becomes the authoritative basis of the religious leaders' accusation against the disciples. Furthermore, Jesus' first response, verses 6 to 13, ignores the disciples' infraction completely and instead hones in on the religious leaders' justification, namely the tradition of the elders, verses 8, 9, and 13. Jesus counters this faulty foundation in a sharp tone, "You're hypocrites," and "In vain you worship me," verses 6 and 7, and cites the Hebrew Bible as a witness. Since the religious leaders reach back to the tradition of the elders in support of their accusation, Jesus cites even older and more credible sources for his position, the prophet Isaiah, verse 6, and Moses, whom Jesus identifies as speaking the commandments, verse 10. Jesus' response can be summarized as two accusations. The leaders leave and reject the commandments of God, and this is followed by the case-in-point example of the Korban, verses 10 to 12, summarized by a final indictment of making void the word of God. Additionally, Jesus gradually reduces the authority of the tradition of the elders by referring to it first as the tradition of men, then as your tradition, and finally as the tradition they perpetuate. You do this. You pass down this tradition. Jesus regards the scribes and Pharisees' deferral to the authority of the elders only as a veiled attempt to assert their own opinion and authority over the people. In this first section of the pericope, Jesus upholds the commandments as coming from or belonging to God in contrast to man-made tradition. In the parallel phrase in verse 13, the commandments of God are even the word of God in verse 13. The dichotomy in this response is the tradition of men versus commandments of God, and Jesus accuses the leaders of rejecting the latter. In the second section, verses 14 to 23, is a second response that Jesus addresses the crowd with an enigmatic parable. The meaning escapes the disciples, and they inquire of Jesus in private about this parable. Jesus responds with the repetition of the parable, after which Mark summarizes the speech with the participial phrase, "cleansing all foods." That's where the problem is. Jesus then points to a list of vices that come out of the heart of a person and cause defilement. 4 of these vices are directly derived from the 10 Commandments: theft, murder, adultery, and coveting, in verses 20 to 21. Additionally, Clavens has pointed out that deceit is based on Deuteronomy 25 and Leviticus 19, and that blasphemy is associated with Deuteronomy 21. The vices are primarily based on moral and purity regulations found in the Mosaic literature. In a more implicit sense, Welz argues that the first 9 of the 12 terms in Mark 7, 21 to 22 deal essentially with the second table of the 10 Commandments, with sins against neighbor. The final 3 deal with the first table of the law, with sins against God. In the second response, Jesus is not opposed to the Mosaic commandments, but instead he issues a call to ethical living, based in part on the Decalogue itself. In Mark chapter 7, 1 to 23, Jesus supports the Mosaic commandments in the abstract and in the practical. The religious leaders, on the other hand, reject the commandments in favor of tradition. Furthermore, in his appeal to the crowd and the disciples, Jesus aligns his moral values with Mosaic regulations. Based on this setting of the passage, it is difficult to argue for an antinomian or against the law Jesus. The difficult participial phrase needs to be interpreted in light of the immediate Markan context to determine its proper meaning. Defilement. The traditional view has generally argued that the cleansing activity Mark ascribes to Jesus, verse 19, is in response to unclean animals. This is based on several assumptions. Food, the word broma. First, it's assumed that the cleansed food refers to meat of unclean animals, Leviticus 11. But this is hard to assert from the literary and historical context. So just to insert here, cleansing all foods generally has been understood as cleansing all of the unclean meat. But that's hard to assert. Technically, broma can refer to both bread and meat. It's a generic term for food. In the Pauline writings, this term does refer to meat, 1 Corinthians 8, but the use in the Gospels is more generic, as broma identifies items considered edible by the community, Matthew 14 and Luke chapter 3 and 9. In attempting to understand the term, the historical context cannot be eliminated. The question must be asked, what would a member of the early Christian sect arising out of Judaism have considered edible food? Certainly our modern cultural practices and sensitivities are not in focus. The question instead must be considered what Mark and the audience of his gospel understood as edible food. Is the reference point for Mark and his audience Greco-Roman practices or Jewish practices? And more specifically, Jewish sectarian practices or practices rooted in the Hebrew Bible? Though the question of Mark's audience is notoriously difficult to answer, the passage itself allows a few conclusions based on the narrative asides. Mark's audience is unaware of some of the details of Jewish ritual practices, hence the need for a lengthy narrative aside in verses 3 to 4. The aside explains the practices of cleansing household items and the ritual manner of washing with the fist. And then a further aside in verse 11 clarifies the meaning of the korban, another detail of Jewish tradition. At the same time, the author does not find it necessary to explain the importance of Isaiah or Moses to the readers, nor the significance of scriptural references from various places in verses 6, 7, and 10. Mark expects his audience to know the role and function of Isaiah and Moses and the meaning of scriptural references from the Hebrew Bible. Additionally, the author assumes the audience can follow Jesus' arguments on regulations of the Hebrew Bible versus tradition. On an equally important note, Mark is very astute at observing and chronicling the practices of the Jews. Recent studies by James Crossley and others have demonstrated that Mark is correct in his assessment of the Jewish practices mentioned in the narrative aside. Thus, Boyarin can assert, it's clear that Mark knew very well what he was talking about when he discussed the Pharisaic ritual practices and purity rules. Clinton Wallin further notes that an examination of its uses in the Septuagint, Josephus, and Philo shows that it, broma, is not normally understood to include unclean animals or meat improperly slaughtered. Moreover, the internal and external literary context of the bread motif helps identify food. In the opening passage of the pericope, Mark makes a twofold reference to bread. The disciples eating bread in verse 2 with unwashed hands becomes the lightning rod for the religious leader's accusation in verse 5. Similarly, the subsequent passage refers to the children's bread and small crumbs, obviously from bread before. These references to bread fit the larger Mark and bread motif and will be discussed in detail below. So here, the whole point is that it's that actually bread is more in view rather than, and the grain is more in view than actually unclean animals. Now so in conclusion, Wallin therefore translates verse 19, thus he declared ritually pure all permissible foods. Let's talk about the cleansing for a moment. Second, the traditional view assumes that cleansing, katharitzo, purifies the unclean. Surprisingly, the term unclean, akathartos, is not employed in the passage at all. Instead, the much rarer koinos and koino, often rendered defiled or common, word group is repeatedly used. And here are the 7 references. As noted above, this term has traditionally been equated either with the term akathartos or the word group bebelos or bebeloo, though no consensus exists on how koinos and koinoo relate to these terms. Several scholars have begun to challenge the long-held views that these two terms are equivalent to other purity terminology. 2 of them will be briefly discussed because of their different approaches. So now I discuss 2 different ones. Here's Derrett, who says we shouldn't conflate the 2, but then supports the view that these should be linked with other terms, with the connective or. Christian Stettler then opines the opposite. So there are different views of how to study it. The key passage to understand this might be in 1 Maccabees 1, 43 to 50, because this is the first time that koinos is actually found in the literature that we have. The passage in 1 Maccabees 1 is a lament over a new law the king has released, forcing the people to break Jewish purity regulations. Purity terminology is abundant in this section, including bebeloo, maiaino, koinos, and akathartos. The syntactical construction of the passage is rather unique and important to the resolution of the passage. After the introductory clause announcing the action of the king, the first of 10 purpose infinitives is listed, indicating the desired result of the king's new laws. The subsequent verses list in detail all the affected areas of Jewish life by the decree by using an infinitival clause containing either 1, 2, or 3 anarthrous objects connected by kai. We can see that in a table below. We'll probably, for purposes of time, skip over that. But what we see is the relationship between these 2. Each infinitive construct refers to objects from a similar category. Critically, though, the objects in the infinitive clauses are not interchangeable. They just address different elements within the larger category. So burnt offering, sacrifices, and drink offerings fit the same category of ritual offerings, but cover different sacrifices. Similarly, and here's the important passage, the phrase sacrifice swine and defiled animals does not refer to swine which are unclean animals, but rather swine and also other defiled animals. Contrary to Stettler, then, the term koinos in 1 Maccabees 1:47 does not denote a separate category of animals that is distinct from clean or unclean animals. It does denote a separate category. As a result, the two major references to koinos and konor, besides the purity passage in Mark 7, in the Septuagint and in the New Testament, 1 Maccabees and Acts demonstrate a clear distinction between purity terminology. So before that, we've always put those together. I'm arguing that these are very different terms. And here you can see this construction, and the critical part is here in verse 47, where we have the koina right here, a form of koinos. Now we come to Leviticus 11. The solution to these multiple purity terms can best be achieved by understanding impurity in the Hebrew Bible. And Leviticus 11 is a good case in point. We have two sections. At the beginning and at the end, A and A prime, these list the criteria and examples of clean and unclean animals in various categories. Here the categories are only described. These animals can be said to be existentially unclean. That is, their status is not a result of any action, voluntary or involuntary, and cannot be remedied. Linguistically, these sections A and A prime differentiate the term unclean from other concepts by employing tameh as an adjective, usually a predicate adjective, to convey the state of idea. Additionally, the only prohibition for the human being is to avoid ingestion, not touch. You can touch a pig, that's not a problem. You shouldn't eat a pig. This ingestion, though, is strongly prohibited, and the text gives no remedy in the event a person should ingest an unclean animal. So this is existential. In contrast to this, section B addresses a completely different issue, namely the issue of humans or objects coming in contact with a dead carcass. In other words, touch impurity. So one is existential impurity and the other is touch impurity, and both are found in Leviticus 11. Here, a direct action results in a person or object becoming unclean. So you have to do an action. Thus, consequently, this section uses the verbal form of unclean before we had the adjective to convey the act of contracting uncleanness, not the state of being unclean. These central verses in section B further give a detailed list of remedies for this contraction based on the material of the object that comes in contact with the carcass. Usually the remedy consists of ritual washing and the passing of time, but can also lead to the destruction of some objects that cannot shed the uncleanness. So Leviticus 11 points to two distinctly different types of uncleanness. This is something that I think we have traditionally overlooked, namely existential and permanent, but also touch impurity. The former refers to the distinction of clean and unclean animals, the later to touch contamination. Critically, the two do not mix except in the death of a carcass. The chapter closes by summarizing the two categories of uncleanness and introduces the rationale for the above regulations. Surprisingly, the rationale for chapter 11 is not health, but is actually the holiness code, for I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourself, therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. And then it concludes, the uniqueness of this expression can hardly be overstated. This reference to holiness as rationale for a regulation is the first occurrence of holiness language that is characteristic only of the holiness code in Leviticus 17 to 19. The holiness code in its larger setting, 17 to 26, is built upon holiness statements as rationale for various laws that include ethical statutes. And here then we have several ethical and moral laws. You shall not lie, 19 verse 11. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, 19:18. By employing the shared holiness language, the purity terminology in Leviticus 11 receives the same rationale and weight as the holiness code itself, the holiness of God himself. In the next section, I'm going to be arguing that the connection between Mark 7 and Leviticus 11 is actually not the existential and permanent section, the unclean animals, but instead it is all about touch impurity in Mark chapter 7. So Mark is referencing to the B section of Leviticus, not the A section. So here you see Mark references hands and touch. He uses household items that are parallel to Leviticus 11. Third, he points to ritual washings that include submerging of household items, nipto and baptizo, in allusions to Leviticus. Fourth, Mark employs the word broma that fits broma in the Septuagint in Leviticus 11. Fifth, Mark also refers to the cleansing action katharizo, as does Leviticus, but it is not found in sections A and A prime. So here, the reference, though, the big difference is that there is no reference to the carcass in Mark. There's only the reference in Leviticus 11. As a result, Mark clearly connects to touch impurity without equating the touch impurity in chapter 7 to the same exact intensity or quality of Leviticus 11, 24 to 40. Here, the summary. Mark purity passage closely patterns the touch impurity section B of Leviticus, in specific words, practices, and objects. The cleansing activity in Mark 7:19, therefore, is set in the context of touch impurity, not existential or permanent impurity. The cleansing can therefore not refer to unclean animals, as has traditionally been assumed. At the same time, Mark's reference to touch impurity is only modeled and not a one-to-one comparison. Next, this section will deal with the connection to Acts 10 and 11. Suffice it to say, I'm going to summarize here that these two are linked in their understanding of a difference between katharizo and akathartos and our word koinos and koino. They're different terms, not the same terms. And here's a lengthy explanation of that we're going to skip over for purposes of time. The summary is here. In summary, the koinos koinoa category is a Second Temple period development that identifies animals or people as defiled if they have come in contact or proximity with an unclean animal or person. It is important to note that Leviticus 11 does not note any touch impurity that can be derived from an existential permanent state, nor that human beings can or should be categorized into clean and unclean. In fact, the contrary must be asserted. Leviticus 11 makes distinctions based on species, but makes no distinctions between a species, black sheep versus white sheep. The vision in Acts 10 contradicts the extensions developed during the Second Temple period and therefore allows the gospel to be preached to Cornelius and all the people. So here are the answers in this paper that I've now read and shared with you, the answers to some of the questions that we had. This can be seen as one passage. There are more arguments for that. For one, Jesus doesn't fully answer the question of the scribes and Pharisees in the first section. Only in the second question does he actually answer the question that they had. So the second section is a direct response actually to the question of and the charge of the scribes and Pharisees, and therefore they should be understood as one passage. That means that verse 19 should be understood in the whole context of those verses and the cleansing and touch impurity. In the end, Jesus is actually not saying anything about clean and unclean animals. What he is talking about in this passage is that this new category that we find introduced in the Maccabees, this koinos that we first hear about, is a Second Temple invention that extends the animals that we find into human beings. But both of those are not actually found in the Markan passage. And so Jesus is accusing the religious leaders and in fact indicting his disciples as well, that they have made distinctions between human beings. Now we'll see that in Acts and also in the larger view of the mission of Jesus. He did everything for the Jewish Christians and for the Jews, the miracles, and then he copies them right after this. And the Syrophoenician is the first woman outside of Israel to receive a healing miracle. Jesus duplicates that and demonstrates that he is actually somebody that is here for everybody. These distinctions, these purity ideas no longer exist, touch impurities. But existential purity, which is related to the food, Jesus doesn't actually even comment about it. The assumption being that it would continue to be a valid category that his followers followed in his time. Jesus, though, is challenging Second Temple views of distinguishing ritual purity, making that a mandate for everybody, touch impurity, and making that a case for how we interact with one another. I think we have, as a community, lots to learn about that, because we have, as I introduced at the beginning, made quite a number of statements that still imply ritual purity in our modern age, even though we see Jesus addressing some of those issues here in this passage. I hope that gives you a sense of the complexity and the different approaches and how people have tried to solve this very complicated passage, but also a way forward by linking some of those crucial arguments and looking at the text to find solutions from Scripture itself. With that, I'll turn it over to some questions, if there are some questions that you have that you want to throw my way.
Thank you, Dr. Mueller, for your presentation. The first question is there any clear command in the New Testament to avoid unclean foods?
Is there a clear statement? No, there is no clear statement that says thou shalt not eat pork or anything like that. There is no clear statement on that. We have multiple passages that say you shouldn't worry about any eating clean or you shouldn't be worried about food. How they are to be understood need to be understood and looked at in their respective contexts. Very often they refer to food worship offered to idols. But that is the challenge of the passage. We don't have any explicit statement that we should not continue. The closest we have that we should not have that we should not eat in Acts chapter 15 that is not properly slaughtered. That is the closest statement that we have, where it talks about slaughtering, but not about the category itself. That means we could imply that it wasn't an issue at the time, and that's probably the best way that we can go, but there's no explicit statement.
All right, the next question is, what is the main difference between koinos and akatortos? And this is still the same question. Could you briefly explain touch impurity?
Very good. Let me begin with touch impurity. So touch impurity is when you touch something and passing on defilement by touching. That would be touch impurity. And the example that I cited, or that Scripture actually cites, is the passage of I've had to switch my camera, so here you see me from a different angle because my camera went out. So I don't know if you can see me on my alternate camera. Okay. Touch impurity is if you touch, for example, a carcass in Leviticus 11. You touch a dead animal, now you are impure. And now if you touch another person, that person is impure. And if that person touches another person, that person is impure. So if you touch something, then you pass on impurity. And there's a whole complicated system of what things produce impurity. The worst offense is a dead animal. And so that's why Leviticus 11, death, is the worst infraction. And it passes at least 4 steps. There are other events that only pass to the next person and not pass on beyond that. But there's a whole complicated system about touch impurities. So the question is, when we talk about unclean, what are we talking about? Because we have both examples, the state of being unclean and the action of being unclean. And so we need to be very precise. And I think this is where we haven't been precise enough, both in our community and outside of our community. And I will disagree in my view of the terminology with most of the dictionaries, because they've taken a very generic view of impurities and just said, well, there's one view. You'll find a lot of articles that will actually now challenge this and say, well, actually, we need to be more nuanced in our understanding of the language. And so now we come to the terminology, akathartos and katharizo, cleansing and uncleanness, or kathartos. They refer to clean and unclean. And that can be a variety of things. That can be existential clean and unclean, or ritual unclean. It can delimit you for a period of time, or it can, we don't even know. If you eat an unclean animal, it just doesn't even say what's going to happen to you. So in the Old Testament, that can be used for a variety of things, and the context lets us know. When we come to the New Testament, we now are introduced to a new word, and that is the koinos kono. And I already explained how that is an odd word, because it doesn't actually talk about profanity or defilement. It actually says common, so it sounds like a very weak defilement process. And when we look at the first Maccabees in Acts 10 and 11, we see that this is a in-between category where touch impurity is involved. So this category, to put it into simple terms, would be a pig that is existentially unclean touching a sheep. That sheep is existentially clean, but because it has come in touch contact with a pig, has now been considered unclean and unfit for eating, and therefore defiled or common. So you can't eat it anymore because it has been touched by a pig. But this is an extension of the Old Testament. The Old Testament doesn't specify it. There's no problem touching a pig in the Old Testament. There's no transfer. Only a dead animal in Leviticus 11 passes on impurity. So by this extension, new ideas were promulgated, namely that you have to be worried about the person that you come in contact with, because they might be existentially unclean. And Jesus is saying that is not what I was talking about in Leviticus, in essence, in summary. Don't make up new rules. Follow the rules that I've given you. People are not unclean in this existential sense. It's no problem going and visiting people. You will not become defiled. And we recognize this ourselves, right? We tell our children, don't have company with these people. They are dirty. Well, who? Well, sometimes we've used it for racial separation. But this is not a biblical concept. Sometimes we've used it for moral things. Do not go into a bar because those people there are unclean or they're not good. But why can't we go there? Well, because there is alcohol involved. Sure, nobody's condoning the use of alcohol, but we have this idea that you become unclean and defiled by being in a place. And this actually harkens back, or being in touch with some people. And Jesus challenges this when he meets with the prostitutes, when he meets with tax collectors. Jesus challenges this notion that some people, because of their actions or because of their behavior, are lesser people and are therefore impure. And Jesus challenges this in an example and in wording. And here we have the wording that explains Jesus' behavior.
All right. The next question we have is, we have two more questions. I think they are addressing the same issue. So let me read the first one. Practically today, how should the church deal with the issues of ritual purity? What should be a biblical way of dealing about it? And the other question is based on Leviticus chapter 17, verse 13. It says that even if you should hunt and kill a bird or animal, You must drain out the blood and cover it with soil. Leviticus 17 verse 13. I think this has to do with proper slaughtering. And then the question is, do we need to verify whether or not chicken in the mall is killed in compliance with Leviticus chapter 17? And the first question again is, practically today, how should the church deal with the issues of ritual purity? What should be a biblical way of dealing about it?
Okay, two very practical questions. The first one is, I think we need to come back to this understanding of that Jesus is promoting, not just here in Acts, in Mark, but also in Acts. And that is that we should not make distinctions with people. Now, this is a deeply mission-oriented topic, actually. And I wasn't aware when I started studying this. Just to give you a short thing that I didn't cover in the passage, in Mark, we have duplicates, stories that are basically the same told twice. And people for many years have wondered, this is ridiculous. Why is there a feeding of 5,000 and a feeding of 4,000? This must be the same event that is just being told by two different people, and Mark redacts it and puts it together. It's stupid to repeat this. Or healing of a blind man, or stories of women and children. So we have Jairus and the woman with the blood flow, and then we have the Syrophoenician woman. We have child that is in danger, and then a woman that comes to Jesus, and that we have in the Jairus and the woman with the blood flow story. And then we have the same thing again with the Syrophoenician woman in a slightly different context, but the same kind of characters and the same outcome and the same kind of child and the same death event that is looming for the child. Why are these just being duplicated? And then why do we have a story where Jesus talks about bread and has a big feast, and then he warns about the dough of the... Well, actually, these all parallel each other. And Mark 7 is right at the center. And right after that, you have a parallelism, and that is called the bread motif, that you have this whole passage about bread. And at the center of it is this passage that Jesus speaks about, don't make a difference between people. The first section is all about Jesus's Jewish ministry. And the second is he's replicating the same miracles, but now for the pagans. So this is this in Mark. Mark doesn't have these clear statements like Matthew has, where he says, go into all the nations and tongues and languages and proclaim my news. Mark doesn't have a clear statement of removing Jewish nationalism, but he has these implicit and very deeply woven stories where he's actually saying that and much more. So how should we deal with ritual impurity? I think the first thing to consider is that we make distinctions of people and people groups and people within our community and people outside of our culture group or our fellowship, and we say these are lesser people. These are people that aren't worthy, or they will make you something or other. And these all stem from this purity concept, and I think they're all wrong. Jesus had this view that it doesn't matter, even if you are a person that has moral issues, such as prostitutes, you are not somebody worth shunning. You're somebody that's worth including. I will go to you. I will meet you. Tax collectors, they didn't perform the ritual washings. They were ostracized by the society. They didn't do morally good things oftentimes. And yet, Jesus is the one that goes to them and meets with them and associates with them. And everybody says, how can you even meet with them? How can you go to their house? Because you're going to be defiled. And Jesus says, no. And that is where this great mission story actually resonates in. We're called to go to everybody, not just the people on our social strata, not just the people that we feel comfortable. We're supposed to go to the dirty people as well, both the morally dirty and the physically dirty and the ritually dirty people. There is no distinction between people. I think that's the key takeaway that Jesus is. And in this case, this is a very missional story. And that's why Acts 10 and 11 is the turning point in the mission of the New Testament congregation, because this was the big barrier. We do not associate with these evil people, the Romans. They're morally corrupt, they're ritually corrupt, they're dirty people, and that's why we don't go and meet with them. And the vision of Acts 10 and 11 is exactly that, the same words, koinos, koinoo, and the same idea of do not call defiled what I have cleansed. So the same idea, and it's the same mission turning point. And so I think that's the big thing that I think we need to consider. Nobody is unclean in that sense anymore. Jesus wants to remove this barrier that we build between human beings. That I think is the most important thing. Maybe the second thing is don't invent new rules. Just stick to God's rules. They're sufficient. We don't need to invent new rules for you're permitted or not permitted to do this or that. We're very good at inventing new rules, and we never grow out of them. They might be helpful sometimes when you're raising kids to set boundaries and kind of keep things important or valuable, but we never grow out of them, and that's the problem. And then they become statutes and traditions, and Jesus challenges these traditions and says they're not biblical. Stick to the biblical thing, don't invent new rules. And if you think about it, how many rules we have for what is proper Sabbath observance, what is proper Friday evening etiquette, what is proper this or that, what are you allowed to do, what are you not allowed to do. We have a lot of side rules and extra rules. And they are just traditions. And sometimes these traditions get into the way. Sometimes they can be valuable and helpful. Other times they get in our way. And it means constantly reevaluating what is getting in my way of my relationship with God and my relationship with other human beings. That might make me a hindrance, not a value to God's mission to people. So that was the first question. The second question was slaughtering and proper slaughtering. I'm a vegetarian, not because I think it's biblical mandate, but because of health reasons, and I grew up that way. I do not impose that this is the only way to do it. The Bible, again, is clear. I think is clear. I would still consider the Leviticus 11, the existential purity laws to apply, namely no pork. I think there's nothing in the New Testament that says that should be changed. There's nothing that says it needs to continue, but there's nothing that says it should be changed. And so it was assumed in the early community that this continued. So I think that's the biblical mandate. Everything else is self-afflicted, self-imposed. And for me, I impose that on myself, and I am happy that way. But it's not a necessity for everybody, I understand. That being said, I'm not confronted with it. I do think that the repeated use of that, and if you want to have somebody that has written and talked about this quite a bit, is Roy Gain. He has written on this and spoken out about this. He would argue, and I think he has some very good points, that all food should be kosher food. The imagery of the life is in the blood is so important to the Levitical code, and not just to the ritual purity. This is not about touch impurity. This is about an existential law. That is a restriction. And in fact, that is the one rule that Acts 15 continues and says you should only eat kosher slaughtered animals. And that is something that Paul never challenges. The ancient world would have adhered to that and understood that, especially in the Jewish context, that was very strong about that. So that is something that I would encourage people to reflect upon in their own personal practice if they do eat meat.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Mueller, for your presentation as well as your answers. Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I want to encourage each one of you to get ready for the next meeting. God bless you as you are preparing to join us next time. Before we wind up this program, I would like to invite the presenter, Dr. Mueller, to say a prayer.
Sure. Let's have a word of prayer as we close. Dear Lord, thank you for giving us the time as a community here at AIIAS to take time away to study and dig deep into your word. It's always rewarding, and there's always more to see and to understand and to grow into. You took the disciples away into a retreat, and this is our time for a retreat to study and to reflect on your word, to be better prepared as we enter into the field at some point in the future. Thank you for the ability to sit down and study in detail these difficult questions and to see how they apply into our lives today. I ask that you be with each one that has been listening, and as they reflect on how that impacts their personal life, I ask that you bless them in a special way. Thank you for your word that is enlightening, and as we study it, we grow closer to you. And for that, I want to thank you. Bless us now as we depart, and bring us back together in our following meetings, we ask in your name. Amen. Thank you so much from my side also for joining, and I look forward to seeing you next month for our guest speaker, John Peckham.